Want to learn how to paint cool looking skies with watercolors? Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. I am super excited because today is going to be the first part in a 4-part series dedicated to watercolor landscapes for beginners. In today's video, we're going to be talking all about skies. I'm going to take you through 5 different sky studies in which I'm going to be sharing my tips and tricks with you so that you can incorporate them into your work. Basically, in this series, we're going to be dissecting landscape compositions, so pulling apart the different common elements that make up a landscape in order to create separate studies, and then bring all of our knowledge together at the end to create a complete landscape. In today's video, I'm also going to be touching upon painting distant mountains as well as water. So let's get into the video and let's get to studying. Okay guys, so 2 quick notes before we begin with this tutorial. The first being that I am by no means a traditional watercolor artist. What I do when I am learning a new art medium is learning all I can from people who are more classically trained, but after I have learned the quote-unquote rules of that specific medium and its specific characteristics, I basically start to let my own style come through. And this is something that I really believe in and something that I really encourage my students to do. Once you have learned the rules, by all means, start allowing your own style to come through. Keep in mind what you have to do to enhance the characteristics of that specific medium. And the second thing that I would like to mention before we start is that I am a huge believer in using what you have at hand to create your artwork. So you don't necessarily have to go out and get all of these different types of fancy paintbrushes or the very best paper or anything like that. Honestly, is all going to come down to your own preferences and your own way of working, and these are things that you have to learn for yourself along the way. So for these studies, I am actually using very old paintbrushes that have been attacked by my cat numerous times, and also a paintbrush that I got at Home Depot. I am also using paper that is low quality. I didn't like it at all, but all of these things work. The point here is that I make it work for my studies and I am getting something positive. I am learning something using these supplies. I am experimenting with using them until I arrive at something that I like, that I learn from. And that is what I want to communicate to you. And finally, before we begin, I just want to send a very quick shout out to Jocelyn Abernathy. You're awesome, Joss, and I hope to hear from you soon. Okay, let's begin. So, as I was mentioning before, I am going to walk you through 5 different studies that are going to go from easiest to more complex. And there are a few things that are basically common throughout. Those things, instead of repeating them over and over again, I'm just going to mention them right now since the beginning so you can have them in mind as you're creating your studies. The most important points and common points that you're going to see me apply throughout these 5 studies are: number 1, I always start with the lightest and most translucent values and work my way towards the darker values as I go. Number 2, I never cover up the entirety of my paper. I always allow some whites to show through. And this is very important in order for my finalized piece to have depth and luminosity. Number 3, you have to allow your layers proper drying time in between. And this is going to vary depending on the amount of water that you have placed on it, of course. Through experimentation, you're going to start noticing when you get to a point at which you just have to stop and allow it to dry. Number 4 is that you're going to see me create these studies starting out with the so-called wet on wet technique, which is a great way to make distant elements appear blurry. So basically what you do is cover up your paper with water and place your paints on top of the water, and this is going to create the blurry effect. But as I move forward, as I start to add more details, I allow the paper proper drying time and in general use a less amount of water so that details start appearing more and more sharp. And the final very important point that I want to quickly mention before I get into the individual studies is that as you move along placing your subsequent layers of paint, the point is never to cover up the previous layer entirely. You're always wanting to place the darker values only where needed. The point is not to cover up the previous layer. Remember that what you're trying to do here is create a variety in values. So if you just go and cover up the previous layer completely, all you're doing is creating a flat painting. So you're trying to achieve a variety in values. And to do this, you're always leaving a bit of the previous layer untouched or uncovered by the next darker layer. Okay, so that first study was a very simple one. I only used blue, a rag to lift up some pigment from the paper and create sort of cloud effects. I personally used Prussian blue and ultramarine blue, but you can use only one if you have only one. I started my second study the exact same way that I started my first, by taping my watercolor paper down onto a piece of cardboard using masking tape. And then I used my thickest paintbrush to dampen my paper almost entirely, but I made sure to leave some areas completely dry since the beginning, because every area that is damp is going to have pigment expand on it. And so by leaving tiny areas untouched since the beginning, I am making it easier for myself, and I am ensuring that those areas are going to be left white until the end. And the only two differences really between this study and the one before it is that I wanted it to be a little bit more defined in some areas and a little bit more dramatic. So what I did was add a third color. So for this one I used ultramarine blue, Prussian blue, and permanent carmine, which is a reddish color. And I also added more layers to it. So this second one involved me allowing it to dry, and then I went in with more details afterwards. Notice how I am using for the most part horizontal brush strokes, and I am being very light with my brush strokes. I am doing my best to stay away from thick blocks of color, creating effects of clouds being more defined in some areas and more blurry in others. Keep in mind that when you're drawing anything in nature, any part of landscapes, you are not trying to go for perfectly symmetrical, regular patterns anywhere. That, if you do that, you're just gonna make it look unnatural. So throughout these paintings, I'm making sure that I'm keeping everything organic, irregular, lighter in some areas, darker in others, and so forth. For the third study, I wanted to get a little bit more dramatic and a little bit more complex, and I wanted to add more colors. So I decided to add an effect of a sun in the distance, and this of course meant adding in warm colors. To create the effect of the sun, I made sure to leave a circle untouched by water since the very beginning, so that I made sure that it was completely white until the end. And then, because you're supposed to go from lightest to darkest when you're using watercolors, I made sure to start with my lightest blues and my yellows for the sun first, before going in with my reddish colors. By the way, the colors that I used for the sun were cadmium yellow and cadmium red light. So for this third study, I actually allowed it to dry a couple of times throughout the process because I knew that I wanted to create several layers of clouds. And something important to notice here is that the clouds that are furthest away from us, or the ones that are closest to the horizon line, are going to be smaller than the ones that are further up or closer to us. So do keep in mind that the more detailed that you want your picture to be means you have to create more layers, which means that you have to allow more drying time in between the layers. I decided to go back in at the end and add a darker blue on the top of this sky in order to make it look as if it's getting darker and the sun is setting. I wanted everything to be a little bit more dark. So for study number 4, I wanted to incorporate a mountain. So I sketched this mountain with pencil before starting with my paints. Make sure that whatever sketch you draw prior to painting, you do it lightly. After having sketched the mountain, I went ahead and with my largest paintbrush again, wet my entire sky, and I started placing my blues throughout the sky, leaving some whites untouched so that they could be the clouds, same as before. I wanted the sun to be still shining a bit behind the mountains, so I did the same thing as before and placed my very lightest values first, my lightest blues and my yellows before anything else. Once again, I did some lifting with my rag and allowed my first layers to dry completely. Once my initial layers were dry, I started giving more shape to the rain clouds, and rain clouds are usually darker, so I had to incorporate another color into the mixture to make my blues even darker, and I used a sepia brown mixed together with my blues. So something very important here is that I try to be very careful and deliberate about where I place my darkest values, because remember that you don't want to create blocks of color anywhere. You want to be light and you want to create gradients and keep the darks only in specific places. So whenever I noticed that I was getting too dark, I grabbed my rag again and very lightly did horizontal motions in order to pick up some of the pigment. So you'll notice that whenever I start placing my very darkest values, I almost always go back in with a certain amount of water in my paintbrush in order to smooth that darker blob or block of paint out to create smoother looking gradients. Whenever you find that you have placed a little bit too much pigment on your paper, don't freak out and just either take your rag and lift some of it up, or wet your paintbrush with clean water and do some blending with the colors that are around it. This almost always fixes the problem. And remember guys, that watercolor paints always dry lighter than how they look when they are wet. So be patient, allow your layers to dry in between, and only start placing darker colors where needed after you have seen what it looks like when it's dry. And for the fifth and most complex study that we're going to be doing today, I started it once more with a light pencil sketch. I wanted to incorporate mountains and a small body of water in this one so that we can practice painting water and a bit of water reflection. So for this one, once my pencil sketch was done, I went ahead and wet my sky area again with my biggest paintbrush and did practically the same thing that I have done before. Went in with my blues and my reds and left some areas with no water in them so that they can be the clouds. And don't worry very much if you get a little bit of water or even pigment in the area of the mountains, because since we're trying to create the effect of distant blurry mountains, we don't need them so defined. I allowed the sky and the mountains to dry, and then I started painting in the water. And For the water, I do kind of a similar thing as when I paint the sky. I use horizontal brush strokes and I let areas of the paper completely free of pigment and water because you want to create the effect of light reflection and the ripples on the water. I do use a smaller, thinner paintbrush for the water than I do for my clouds. And basically, the way that you create the effect of reflection on the water is by incorporating the same color of the element or object that is being reflected on it into the blues of your water. So in this case, since I painted my mountains by mixing together ultramarine blue, sap green and my sepia brown, I used that same color mixture within the water, and that creates the believable effect of reflection. Because it is quite important to have our colors well thought out and limiting our color palette, I painted the grass area using the same sap green that I used for the mixture of the mountains. And I started out with a very light wash of green and only started adding in darker green in the foreground. So that's all I did for this one. I wanted to keep this one relatively simple because next week we're going to be doing tree studies. The final thing that I want to say here is that you can notice how I went back into the mountains at the end to sort of pull out some of that pigment and give some more dimension to the mountains. This is a very easy thing to do. All you have to do is clean your paintbrush with water, and by going back into the painting with water in your paintbrush, you can just do some blending and do some lifting. Sometimes when I want to create even blurrier looking mountains, or mountains being even farther away from us, I go in and paint the mountains right on top of the wet sky, so the pigments run together and this creates an even blurrier effect. Okay guys, that was a long one, but I hope that you enjoyed it, that you learned something new, and most of all, that you got inspired to go and create something for yourself. Next week, we're going to be talking all about creating tree studies of different types of trees to incorporate into our landscapes. For more information about this series, as well as the supplies that I used, go ahead and check the description box below. Make sure to also visit my website and blog at ericalancaster.com because I'm constantly coming up with free resources for you guys. Please comment, like, and subscribe, and let me know about any specific frustrations you have regarding watercolors so that I can make sure to take note and include those things in future videos or blog posts. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next week. Bye!